Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only America.
Only in America.
You know, there's one thing that we just don't talk about nearly enough, and that is legal immigration. So this week, a deeper dive into the future of legal immigration.
How are we going to build the nation that we know we have to be and the notion we can become? We saw an armed insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. And to me, like, the central project is, how do we build a more just world, a more just nation, one where everybody has the opportunity to belong and to count as an American? We haven't done that in this country.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani, and this is Only in America. In both rhetoric and policy, the Trump administration created an intensely hostile climate for immigrants. Whether through a xenophobic comment or a new restriction on visas, it was always clear that Trump and his closest advisors sought to fulfill a very particular vision, one of a more isolated, closed-off America. We often saw this play out in headlines decrying the mistreatment of asylum seekers at the border, or families torn apart by increased interior enforcement. But some of the most far-reaching consequences of this anti-immigrant vision came from Trump's consistent attacks on legal immigration. The public charge rule, the discriminatory travel bans, the cuts to visas for students and high-skilled workers. All of these policies combined to lead to a dramatic decrease in legal immigration. In fact, back in July, the National Foundation for American Policy projected that from fiscal years 2016 to 2021, legal immigration would decrease by 49%, with overall levels dropping by more than 500,000 people. But the Biden administration has made it clear that they're going to do things, well, a little differently. Rescinding the travel ban was among Biden's first actions as president, and his administration has announced further plans to remove barriers to legal immigration and to promote citizenship. It's all amazing news, and a great first step towards restoring the legal immigration that strengthens our nation. But a truly successful legal immigration system will take more than undoing Trump's policies. It's going to take an overhaul of a long, outdated system that cannot meet our modern immigration needs. So where do we go from here? What actions can Congress and the Biden administration take? And how do we modernize an immigration system in a way that can respond to our dynamic needs?
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. And from Humanity United. When humanity is united, we can bring a powerful force for human dignity.
My guest this week is Todd Schulte. Todd is the president of Forward.us, which advocates for immigration and criminal justice reform. Forward.us has long been a critical partner of the forum, and they're a key part of the immigration advocacy space. They've done some incredible work on the full range of issues, including the border response to Dreamers and DACA recipients, and one of their main focus areas, in fact, is protecting and strengthening legal pathways to immigration. Todd and I spoke about how Congress and the Biden administration can tackle the remnants of the Trump era, and why a broader vision for a legal immigration system is vital for our nation's future. Hey, Todd, thanks for joining. And before we kind of jump into the issues, tell me a little bit about Forward.us. And, even before that, how you found yourself kind of working on immigration. Because, a lot of people, when they get involved in immigration, all of a sudden they can't get out. So how did you get involved?
I want to thank you for having me, and just start by saying, just obviously such a big admirer of the work that you do, the National Immigration Forum does, and of the podcast. It's great. I'm a first time participant, long time listener, and by way of background, I had for the first decade of my career, really worked in kind of more traditional electoral and democratic governing politics. I've done House and local races and presidential work. I've been a chief of staff for a member of Congress on the Hill. And I've been drawn to political work in general, really by the belief that policy change was such a big lever for improving the lives of so many. And, for me, what unites the work that we're doing on a day-to-day basis on immigration policy, and Forward.us is a bipartisan immigration organization that does criminal justice reform and immigration policy, but unites that kind of day-to-day work with these larger causes. How are we going to build the nation that we know we have to be, and the notion we can become? We saw an armed insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. And to me, the central project is, how do we build a more just world, a more just nation, one where everybody has the opportunity to belong and to count as an American, regardless of their immigration status, regardless of their race and their religion. We haven't done that in this country. To me, what drove me to politics was this broader project of, how do we actually become the multiracial, multi-ethnic, diverse democracy that we have to be? We have to be for the people here today, the people who can be born and come in the future, for other problems we need to solve. And it becomes this unbelievably just depressing system to stare into and understand that, despite the great, amazing, welcoming sense that we have done it albeit very perfectly in parts of our country's history, we have a fundamentally broken system of immigration laws. When the minute you work in government, the minute you see people caught up in the system from a personal perspective, that comes out. And so in 2013, having come off I'd been in an organization called Priorities USA, helping to reelect President Obama, had the opportunity to get involved with helping to start this group with leaders in the business and technology community, with really the vision of, how do we bring together folks from everywhere from the immigrants' rights movement to the business community across the ideological spectrum, and say, how do we really push through, at the time, what we call comprehensive immigration reform, but a fundamental overhaul of the immigration system that works for today's economy, that works for today's families, that is functional, that is humane. And that is what we have been working on in ways big and small for the last couple of years. And there's a long answer to but I'm doing it here with you today. So yeah.
Well, I mean, let's talk about not just the last couple of years, but really the last 4 years. And, so much of the debate has been dominated by what Trump did around the border and child separation, treatment of dreamers, refugee resettlement. But above all of that, there was a much bigger goal that the Trump administration had. So kind of unpack that goal for me.
Yeah, I think that's really probably the central, I want to say at the beginning, misunderstanding of what the Trump administration was about. From the minute the guy came down the escalator and made these demagogic comments about immigrants and about Mexicans, you saw a lot of people dismiss it. I mean, first as as an entertainer. But you saw people dismiss it. Oh, that's just about the border. Oh, that's just about the wall. And I want to put those, I don't want to say just about there, but that was what people would say. And you would see these excuses made for it. And he was building on a tradition that existed for a long time in this country, which is, people say, oh, I just want people to come the right way, or there's this good immigrant versus bad immigrant, or, oh, I'm not for illegal immigration, I'm for legal immigration. But we just can't get to that right now. But really what you saw, I think, with Trump is someone who took these instincts he had, the xenophobic instinct, and kind of grafted it onto this very serious policy architecture that existed for a generation in this country, which is, let's talk about border security, but actually let's make our central goal just shrinking the number of immigrants coming to this country. Let's make our central immigration cutting legal immigration avenues. And the reason for that is simple. If your goal is to reduce the number of people who are immigrants and the children of immigrants in this country, a ton more people come legally than who cross the border illegally, or who come legally and overstay on a visa. 5, 6, 7 times as many people are coming legally and staying. And so what I think you saw was, from day one of the Trump administration, you saw the attacks on Muslims and the Muslim travel ban. You saw efforts to rescind DACA. But if you remember, there was a moment there where the president had the ability to do this big bipartisan deal. He could have passed a DREAM Act and he could have gotten $25 billion for border security.
Right.
And he said no. And he said no because it didn't come with cuts to legal immigration. So that's what I'm excited to kind of talk about today is after 4 years of Trump and these kind of unprecedented assaults on legal immigration, we have a hole to dig out of. I think that is such an important thing. But ultimately, we've got to get not just back to where we were 4 years ago, but build a modern and working legal immigration system for the future.
So, like the folks at Migration Policy Institute have tabulated, I want to say, 400 changes to the immigration system put in place by the Trump administration. So we don't have time to talk about all 400, but, I might quiz you on all 400.
I will tell you, they've tracked 400. Another person, I think, is over 900 now. When it was about 700, someone said to me, well, how many of those do you like? And, we kind of zipped through and I said, there's 3 that seem to be somewhat helpful technical improvements to make immigration easier, 2 of which involve reducing the number of faxes and duplicate faxes you have to send. So, it's only been 99.95% designed to reduce immigration to this country.
Right. So out of all those changes, where do things stand, in terms of kind of let's just say the top 3 to 5 issues or efforts to cut legal immigration? What were the things that the Trump administration put into place? Then we can talk about, what a Biden administration should be doing to address those issues.
Yep. So legislatively, they attempted to pass what they call the RAISE Act. They claimed this was to move to what they called a merit-based immigration system. I want to be very clear that it's not the case. The RAISE Act cut legal immigration to this country by 50%. It would be the largest cuts to legal immigration since the racial quota laws of the 1920s. It cut the family-based immigration system, which constitutes about 60-ish% of the number of people get a green card each year. Cut the family-based immigration system by 85%. It made the employment-based immigration system substantially more difficult, and it eliminated the diversity visa and made some other negative changes. Now, that did not pass Congress. It did not even receive 50 votes, let alone 60 votes. And that failed. And really what they set out to do when that failed was through a series of executive actions, restrict immigration to this country, largely doing so by either trying to outright eliminate visa categories or immigration programs, whether that was shrinking the refugee program. I know you've talked about that in other categories, whether it was so kind of outright bans to these programs. They did these travel bans. They would also, another tactic is they make immigration much more burdensome and challenging and expensive. You have to pay more money. You have to go through additional vetting. You have to go 4 times to the consulate at the same time as they were cutting the number of people who would process this. It was really like an all-of-government approach that they did to make immigration harder. A couple big things they did as well, in addition to that, were, you see things like the public charge memorandum, which is designed really as kind of a not even just a wealth test on immigrants, but a subjective test that if you use a benefit, you may use the ability to be cut later. Those were all for a long time, quite frankly, largely they made things more difficult on the margins. They sent a signal to this country that America was not going to continue to want to be the top destination of talent for the world. But we fought a lot of those off in court. And really until the fall of 2019, we were able to hold that back. And then the pandemic came. And under the pretext of COVID, they went through what, I just want to be clear, had they been successful, would have been absolutely the largest restriction of immigration in American history. The Cato Institute said that their plans would have cut legal immigration into this country by 92%. Where we are today is there are a number of restrictions that exist on immigrant visas. The ability as people to come to the United States and eventually get a green card. There's a number of these pandemic restrictions on non-immigrant visas, efforts to rescind things and stop things like H-1B visas, L-1 visas. And then they also made efforts to just hurt the family members of people who are here today, efforts to eliminate the ability of high-skilled immigrant spouses to work. And so really across the sector, you have a mixture of where things are held up in the courts, but immigration has been cut to this country but probably maybe by a third right now in terms of who'd be able to come, maybe 40%. And we've got to dig out of that hole quickly through a series of legislative and administrative actions in the next administration.
Let's start with the administrative actions and, again, kind of differentiating from the encouragement that advocates are offering to the Biden administration, say around DACA or around refugee resettlement, but really kind of these issues around legal immigration would have been changed through executive order by Trump. What should and how could Biden reverse those changes?
Yeah, I think on the first thing, they've made commitments on day one to roll back the travel ban. And it's really, they work in a couple different ways. There's like general travel bans, but there's also, in the cases of a few other countries, including Nigeria, it's really more of a naturalization ban, which is just deeply awful. And for a country who, this is a family friendly podcast, so I won't repeat the president's terms. But clearly, like kind of a deep anti-Muslim, anti-Black racism that's infected the president's immigration policy towards Black immigrants, made it so that people from Nigeria couldn't come and naturalize. So they're going to get rid of these travel bans, these other bans on day one. That's really important. Two, there's these other COVID restrictions on non-immigrant visas and visas. Now, I want to be clear, if there are health and public health reasons, there need to be travel restrictions. That is a totally reasonable thing. Like if there is a reason that travel needs to be restricted, that's fine. That is not what they have done. They have just banned visa categories, right? And so these are restrictions on a variety of these categories, folks who are coming in as guest workers into various sectors, manufacturing, in some cases agriculture, although less restrictions there. Biomedical research, for example, as we seek to build back from COVID, has been restricted to be able to go to international students for universities. So these kind of guest worker and international student programs rolling back there. The third is these COVID restrictions on the ability for people in the employment-based immigration system to get a green card has been more challenging. And then four, they've been trying to make the family-based immigration system more challenging. And what we think is really important is they roll back all those categories of restrictions to get back to where they were. Next step is, how do they modernize systems? There are things that they can do to modernize the legal bureaucracy of immigration under existing law. We think that's important. And the fourth category, and I'm happy to talk more, which is, look, ultimately we need Congress to act here. And I'm happy to talk more. I think that's just such an important thing, is there's only so much that can be done to improve immigration through executive action. And we ultimately need Congress to come together and work to get something done to fix a long broken immigration system.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because, now within a week or two, you'll have Leader Schumer. He's just a much bigger supporter of immigration than McConnell has ever been. So how does Chuck Schumer thread the needle towards constructive immigration reforms?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot we don't know. Are we doing things on 50 or 60 vote margins? To give voters a sense, I mean, Congress has effectively, in terms of the legal immigration system, I'll set aside enforcement here for a second. We kind of created the modern immigration system 55 years ago in 1965, but really like the legal immigration system, high-skilled immigration system as well, it was a function of 1990 congressional action with like what I would say a tweak is in 1998. So to put that into context, our legal immigration system in this country predates the fall of the Soviet Union. It predates the rise of the World Wide Web. India and China had not entered kind of the global marketplace. There was not this like global rising middle class. The modern global economy didn't exist. If you look at migration patterns to the United States and how they've shifted over the last 30 years and being responsive to that, the world of 1990 is so radically different than the world of today. So how do you get Congress together to fix that, and what do you want to do? I think the first thing is, in terms of how you do the work, is, and this is the work that you all do so well, is you get outside of DC and you make sure members of Congress are hearing from people who matter to them in their district and they're understanding these stories. That's not just employers, but it's employees too. It's not just the people who are speaking at churches, but it's the people in the pews who are there on Sundays. It's immigrants and their families, and it's their neighbors too. And I think that's such an important part. What we'd like to see on the legal immigration system is there are areas to make it so that it should be easier for U.S. citizens and LPRs to adjust for family members to come to the United States, right? Like if you find the person that you want to spend your life with, America should be a place that makes it exceedingly easy for you to bring your family together here. So that's the first thing. I think there's improvements to the family-based immigration system we should be able to agree upon. The concept of family and family unity is so important. The second is, in terms of kind of the employment-based system, we should have the ability to allow people to come to this country to work. That gives them the ability to do so. It gives companies the ability to recruit folks to do that, but it gives workers like basic rights. And whether that is the ability of a software engineer in Silicon Valley to come on an H-1B visa and get to a green card and change jobs, or whether it's the ability for a farm worker to adjust status and become a citizen, we should be able to do that. We think like the best approach is a little bit TBD, right? What we will be really focused on outside of kind of this legal immigration system, and I know you all too, is a pathway to citizenship for the undocumented. And whether or not we're passing one big bill or a series of medium-sized to big bills, we just want to see Congress, both parties, prioritizes this issue right out of the gate. That is such an important thing, is to prioritize this issue in the weeks to come.
Let's take a step back, because I think right now, I'm all caught up in kind of the events of January 6th, Georgia, the election in November. But let's kind of think about kind of having this conversation in March of 2021 or beyond. The economy is still struggling. Millions of Americans are still out of work. How do we as advocates need to have the conversation with the American public about the value of immigration moving forward?
I think the first thing to understand is you need to both meet people where they are a little bit, but realize that like when we have conversations on the point you raised, which is like this idea, subtle and other, that immigrants are somehow competing against Americans, that is just completely factually untrue in terms of how the economics of this work out. We are going to be able to rebuild this country better if America is the top destination for people from around the world. That is a grad student coming here to work on AI for more efficient agriculture, or whether or not that is a mother who is willing to do what she can to survive persecution in her home country and bring her kid here on her back. Those are people we want here in this country, and those are people we want here in this country as we recover from this pandemic. I think one lesson from the pandemic is we're not all in this together in terms of these things. We've seen this in how it's been frontline workers. It's been Black and brown and immigrant and indigenous communities who've borne the brunt of this. But how do we build back so we are in this with a more equitable footing moving forward? I think like basic treatment for immigrants is so important. And if we're talking about people coming here in the future, we can either be the country that develops the vaccine or we can't. It's a choice. And we won't win by default anymore. We can either be the country that builds the generation that says this is how we're going to decarbonize our technology, and it can be a huge economic win, or that can be someplace else. We can make the choice to do this. But if you think, and you're talking to somebody, if you think that in the midst of a pandemic, that somehow if we've purged the Central Valley of California of farm workers who weren't born here, that somehow that what's best for America is to throw those people out and have a bunch of native-born Americans drive out to the Central Valley to decide they can figure out how to pick lettuce, which is really hard. That's not the right way to go. If we're a growing country, if we're a country that welcomes and accepts people, that's going to be best for all of us. And the ability to have people come and contribute right away is so important. We should have everybody in a legal playing field. We should give people legal status so that bad employers can't undercut wages. But that's how we're going to grow back together.
What makes you optimistic about the next 4 years?
Look, I think if you look at public opinion data, despite the fact that this very sophisticated and visceral anti-immigrant movement policy architecture has been kind of trying to dismantle the immigration system, that while they have done incredible harm to human beings, they've failed from their perspective. I don't say that to be spiteful, although I don't wish them luck in any of their endeavors here. But they look at this as they failed. They have not accomplished their long-term goals. Number two, why am I optimistic? Because public opinion support for immigrants and immigration is at an all-time high. Whether that is support for DACA recipients and the outcry trying to end DACA, whether it was the fact that the zero-tolerance family separation policies at the border were the biggest story in the world and the outrage and reaction against that for 3 weeks. Public opinion is on our side to get this done. And I think, elected leaders know that. It is our job to push and pull and do all these things with policymakers. But I'm optimistic that after 4 years of Trump and understanding who is bearing the brunt of this pandemic right now, but after 4 years of Trump in this, I'm optimistic that policymakers will say, if we're going to call somebody an essential worker, they deserve legal status. And if we're going to say that we value immigrants, we want to do this, we got to fix our legal immigration system. If we want to live up to the ideals of the best of what this country can be, we need to have a system of laws that actually reflects that. And, I'm optimistic. I will tell you, when we were all watching what was happening at the Capitol, I was on a call with a couple Hill offices right before then, and it was to talk about like what policy we can get done. And then quickly within a couple minutes, people said, "Gotta go, gotta go." And then later that night, when I was texting people to check see how they were doing, they appreciated that. They said, "We'll call you tomorrow. We got to get back to work on this. Like this is ultimately about the question of like how do we build the country we need to be." So that makes me optimistic.
So last question for you, and just to finish this sentence, only in America, ...
Oh, boy. I think only in America is the imperfect journey to define what we can be America. It is the driver of the best of our angels and at times the worst. Only in America is that like perpetual struggle of defining what it means, a place that we have to draw inspiration from. And that's way more than a sentence, but I would just close by saying, I think in times like this, it's important. You hear people say like, this isn't who we are, but we are many things. We contain multitudes. We are absolutely what we saw, and we are absolutely the people who hours later said, we got to go back in there and we've got to do this peaceful transfer of power. That's what America is. And how do we live up to the best of what we can be as I think the challenge of our times. So, yeah.
Hey, Todd, thanks for joining it. And, before you go, I just also want to thank you personally, but also all of the folks at Forward. We work with you all practically every day, and you're just one of our best and strongest partners in a lot of different ways. So really appreciate what you all do. So thank you.
Well, that's very kind, and we feel the same, my friend.
Todd Schulte is the president of Forward.us. You can learn more about Todd and Forward.us's work at immigrationforum.org. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to Only in America, wherever you're listening to this episode. Stay tuned for next week's preview of our upcoming season on immigrant healthcare and vaccine access amid COVID-19. Only in America is produced and edited by Joanna Taylor and Becca Wall. Our artwork and graphics are designed by Carla Leja. Me, I'm Ali Nurani, and I will talk to you next week.